Hello, and welcome to our annual Leslie Brittman Literary Arts event. I'm Rachel Wimberly, the Director of Arts and Culture at Shalom, Austin, and I'm so honored to get to share this very special event with you all. This program is sponsored by the Brittman family in honor of Leslie Brittman, who passed away in 2016. We thank Marvin, Rochelle, and David for their continued support. The Leslie Brittman Literary Fund fosters a love of literature and the sharing of ideas. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Bess Kalb, Emmy-nominated TV writer and The New Yorker contributor, as she shares her debut memoir, Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, a true, as told to me story. After reading this heartwarming and hilarious tome about Bess's grandmother, Bobby, we knew that Bess was the perfect fit for the Brittman event, and we think you will agree. A few housekeeping notes. Rochelle and Bess will chat for 40 or so minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. I'll be manning the chat. You can enter the questions into the chat as you think of them, or you can hold them until the end of the discussion, and then I will bring them to Bess and Rochelle. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor to our esteemed author and host, Rochelle Kraus and Bess Kalb.
Hello. Thank you, Rachel. Can everyone hear me? Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, and everyone at Shalom Austin, and welcome, Bess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Everyone out there, hi, and thank you all for joining us. Wish I could see your faces and hug every one of you. This is the next best thing for this year, and hopefully next year we will be back to in person. I just want to take a quick moment to say, as Rachel mentioned, and many of you know, that this event came to be out of a desire to carry on my mother's legacy of her love of reading and ideas and of people, and of bringing people together to commune and discuss books and ideas. And it's been almost 5 years. In March, it'll be 5 years since she passed, and so many of you out there still miss her and feel the depth of her absence like I do. So thank you everyone for coming together in this virtual way to honor her. So this is the 5th year that we are doing this event. This stack of books behind me here are the previous year's authors. Each book has been different and stands on its own, but one theme that each one shares, and that was so central to who my mother was, is how we meet life's challenges and what we choose to see in the face of difficulty. These books give us all kinds of models for how we can keep putting one foot in front of the other with grit and humor and grace. They reflect the human experience in a way that is both thinking and feeling, and boy did Bess's book bring to the surface a range of feelings. You are such a beautiful writer. You made us laugh, you made us cry, and in this very accessible, unassuming way, laid bare some very deep truths that I really look forward to us talking about tonight. And I know my mom would have loved this book so much. So let me tell everybody a few things about our author. Bess Kalb is an Emmy-nominated writer for the Jimmy Kimmel Live television show and journalist with the New Yorker magazine. She received a Writers Guild of America award for television comedy variety talk series in 2016. She wrote for the Emmy Awards in 2012 and 2016, and for the Academy Awards in 2017 and 2018. And she's the author of the best-selling book, Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, a true as told to me story, which recounts the life of her grandmother, Bobby Bell. So Bess, thank you so much for being here.
Rochelle, thank you for having me. Everybody at Shalom Austin's literary community, I'm so happy you're here with us. And Rochelle, I want to say how meaningful and special it is for me to be doing an event that pays tribute to your mother. She sounds like an incredible woman, and it's exactly the type of project that this book was for me. Is an idea of matrilineal connection beyond the grave, so that the book resonated with you in the way that it did really does bring the project full circle for me in a way that makes me as both an author and a human feel very validated and I'm sure that she would be so proud of this incredible event that you've put on for so many years, and it is truly an honor just to participate in it. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Well, I was just going to start with maybe asking you to tell everyone a little bit about the book, because not I would imagine not every I don't know who's read it or not. If we were in person, I would ask. But so
It's
if you want to just tell everybody.
Yeah. I mean, half of my own family has not, although all of my family says they've read it. There are like little hints that, like, my husband and I will do sometimes, being like, how about that? How about that scene with the hurricane? It's just like things that didn't happen in the book. And like, people are like, yes, oh, beautiful, heart-wrenching. Yeah.
I love it.
Really, it's for our own music. We would never tell them. We're just like, out of the will. Like, they don't get the pile of note cards that we have. But yeah, I for those of you who haven't read it, the book is a love letter to my grandmother, but it's written as a letter from her to me. It's her autobiography in her voice from beyond the grave, and it tells the story of our relationship. And to make sense of that relationship, it also tells the story about her complicated, problematic, sort of troubled relationship with her own daughter, my mother, and the sort of the difficult relationship with her own mother. And so it is a love story between a grandmother and a granddaughter. It is also an explicitly Jewish story, which is not something that I really thought about much. Going into the project, going into writing this book to commemorate this woman that I missed and loved. But through writing it, I found it to be an unavoidably Jewish story, and one that brought me closer to my roots as a Jewish woman, and one that helped shape for me my Jewish identity in reaction to her Jewish identity and her mother's Jewish identity. So that's what the book was for me. Yeah.
That's very well. We'll get more into that. That's so interesting. But I wanted to ask you to tell everyone about how the book came about.
Sure. So the book,
Well,
yeah, the book came about as a eulogy. The book started I didn't know the book started the night before my grandmother's funeral, but the night before my grandmother's funeral, I had a case of writer's block. It was my job to deliver the eulogy at her funeral in Massachusetts, where she's laid to rest. And I woke my husband up at 2 a.m. and said, okay, would it be in poor taste to do it as my grandma, to do it in her voice? And he was like, potentially. And I was like, just trust me. I've got this. I know what I'm doing. And what that came from was, it was hard for me to talk about grief and to memorialize this woman who meant so much to me in the sort of Western language, this sort of funeral script that is given to us, this sort of obituary speak. There's nothing wrong with it. It just was falling so very short when it came to figuring out how to sort of have the last word on my grandma, a woman who was full of stories and full of her own agendas and her own spin on things. And there was no way that I could do her justice. And so what ended up happening was, the way that I could do that was to just sort of read in her voice, let her actually have the last word at her own funeral, which is a very her thing. I feel like for those of you who know her, meaning for those of you who read the book, you see that would absolutely be the appropriate person to speak at her funeral. As herself. And so what I ended up delivering is a voicemail that's in the book, which is sort of very QVC behind me. For some reason, I never usually have it behind me. But so forgive me for the tackiness of that. But in this, for you to do it is one thing, but it's sort of like showing up to, I don't know what it's like, showing up to your own wedding with like your headshots, or I don't know. I'm like, look how beautiful. But so what ended up being in the book is a voicemail about how she would fly to my parents' apartment, their very small apartment by the hospital in New York City, where they both were doing their medical residency when I was born. Whoops. And how she would sit there and take care of me when I was an infant. And it was this story about a schlep, about how she wasn't a young woman. She would get on a plane and she would sit there in their terrible apartment and we would talk and she would tell me about what happened on the flight. And, and it was fine. They would watch TV and how I said my first words to her. And they were hi. And it was a voicemail that ended with this, with a little twist, as all of them did. She said, Bessie, move to New York by the end of the year. And so I did this voicemail as her for my family. And I looked in the audience and my grandpa was crying and laughing. People were he was crying because he was laughing. They're like he had tears coming down his face and he was rocking in his seat, and my mom and her best friends, and it was like she was there again. And so when I had this impossibly tough room, this audience of bereaved mourners who felt just unfairly yanked from her, then all of a sudden they felt close to her again and were able to hear her, made me feel both as a granddaughter and as a writer, like, oh, maybe I've got something. And what I had done in that funeral was channel her voice. And it ended up for me, you ask how the book came about. It came about out of grief and as a private grieving exercise for myself and for my family. And after the funeral, that feeling of being in that room and knowing that she was recognized by the sort of the toughest critics, by the people who really, really knew her, made me realize I could channel her. And so I just kept writing. And I wrote 40 pages that ended up being the first 40 pages of Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, of her commenting on the funeral, sort of like gently roasting what was going on, and then getting into some stories about her mother and her brothers, the stories that she told me in her life as her. And when I sent them off to my friend and who's a literary agent, Erin Malone, who is a nice Catholic girl from Ohio with like many, many brothers and sisters who never met her grandparents and never had a close relationship with any older relatives. She said, so it's sort of the opposite situation as my family funeral. This is someone who had no connection at all to even the idea of a Jewish grandmother. And she said, yeah, you've got something. And here we are years later. And that's the book.
It's so wonderful in so many ways. Did writing it help you process the grief? And do you want to speak about that for a minute?
Definitely. I mean, that really is that was one of the most surprising things. I thought that writing it, so when I had sent this was sort of like one 40-page burst. Just the first part was this burst of longing and channeling, and I sent that off. And the first reaction I had to Erin saying this is a book was, oh no, I can't do that again. Like that, I wrote that in this cathartic moment, but it would be too painful to shape her whole life and talk about our whole relationship, to talk about her relationship with my mom. Like I can't write this book. It's too painful. And I dreaded it until I sat down and wrote. And what ended up happening was the best possible grief processing. I thought that it would bring me too close to her, and I'd have to go back into that sort of like shock of initially after the departure. Initially after, you can't explain the thought processes you have. This inexplicable thought process for me was writing as my grandma. I didn't want to write it because I didn't want to go back to that sort of no man's land to right after the funeral when I was feeling like an identity upheaval. And instead, it ended up being an incredibly joyous process where I was talking to her. I had this assignment and a deadline, which I take very seriously. And so it was like mandatory therapy to just sort of sit there and have her, which is great as somebody who will like fully go months being like, oh, I can't make it this week again. But the idea of having this little sacred ritual of sitting at my computer, the computer that I'm talking to you on, and talking about this on, which is such a surreal life cycle to have, but of sitting there and just hearing her and having her tell me her stories through me and writing them down, knowing that I was putting them out there in some way and I was making them real and giving them, shaping them and putting them in her voice and making them just right for her. I ended up coming away with it feeling like I had said goodbye, that this book for me was burying her in a book, which for those of you who have read it know that that is how my grandmother lived her the sort of the language very similar to your mother. It's something that I think they shared in common without of course knowing her. My grandmother loved reading and loved books. And, people talk about love language, but it really was her sort of social currency and way of connecting to other people and connecting to this world outside of her, was reading books and then recommending books to friends. And so that I've sort of given her a book feels right.
I love that. I love that so much. Um, can we talk about the voicemails for a minute? I loved everything about the voicemails. And do you think that she, knew that these would end up forever in a book when she left them for you? Or tell us about the voicemails.
No, it's a huge betrayal. I bet if she knew, she would have gotten even more righteous and left even more. But I will say the voicemails that are in the book aren't direct transcriptions. They're not. They're interpretations of the types of voicemails that thematically link to what was being discussed in the story. And they're, for those of you who haven't read it, it sort of goes between prose, voicemail, and conversations. Full pages of dialogue and also pictures. So it's a quick read. Here I am actually hawking it. I should, but it does.
That's what this is for. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, the one question away from giving you a spin, but it was a way that communicated her. Voicemail was her sort of instrument of choice. That she really was a maestro at the art of the voicemail. And so much of what it meant for her to tell her story was to have a captive audience and to just not be interrupted, not have me talking back and being like, Grandma, I'm going to take the subway, just deal with it. Of her being able to sort of have the last word in every way and to have the only word. And so throughout our relationship, some of the funniest and also most honest conversations happened into my voicemail box at me from her. And I think she had a lot more license. And I think the big choice to use them, which of course didn't really feel like a choice at all if I'm just conveying her through book form, they are her. I think she felt like she had the most license to say how she really felt in them. And some of the deepest truths in our relationship came into my voicemail box, and saving them was an act of preserving her. Um, I don't think she knew that I was saving them, let alone using them for a book. I don't think she knew I sort of was collecting them, but um, I can show you guys, one of the things about having this as a Zoom event and not unfortunately not being all together is I can hold up something to the screen and you can see it. But for those of you who read the book, maybe you'll recognize these. Oops, I'm not going to do that. But all of these are the voicemails that I still to this day have saved. And I think the reason for doing that, and I'm sure there's maybe a deeper reason too, but just the mere act of deleting feels too final and too. I'm sure you can relate. The holding on to what you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the bizarre reality of being in this tech world. Like I'm never going to delete that contact. I mean,
Right.
it's just going to be in my phone forever. Yeah.
Having your mom in your phone, that absolutely. It is such a weird, these like these digital remains, the vestiges, the footprints that people who are no longer with us leave behind end up being powerful reminders of their presence, and putting them in a book in that digital form, it felt important to me. And it's great to hear that that's something that people relate to, and I hadn't really seen done, but in talking to people about it, and in in Instagram comments and Twitter direct messages, people have sent me their screenshots of their voicemail saying like, yes, it's the same. I can't delete them. So it's opened up this whole world of secret digital hoarders of the people we miss.
I love that. And I do feel like everyone does that. And I recently just I just did a search of all the emails she ever sent me and with my mother and just started rereading them. And yeah, like she was speaking to me again. So I feel that.
I will say, because I'm seeing a comment to it. So by the way, they're all on the cloud and they're all emailed to me. They're all emailed to my husband in case I get hit by a bus. But they're all everywhere. I just can't physically delete them from my phone. Because first of all, I don't know what the cloud is, and I worry that if I delete them from my phone, the cloud will be like, you deleted it, and now it's. But that act of deleting it, like it feels like a hoarder, but this is my one hoarding tendency.
I don't think so. I don't think so. You were talking about the way the book is structured with the voicemails and the pictures, and it's I loved the structure, and that really felt like part of what was so powerful about the book. How did you come up with that, structuring it that way, and also with the different sections?
Yes, that was a late in the game process. The book was done in sort of flurries of like sheer channeling and these sort of hours long, crazy, just sort of like not eating, not drinking water, just like writing and done in these almost fits of passion. And it sounds crazy, but really what it looked like is like me being alone in my office and then walking out and being like, we don't have anything in the fridge, and like being very cranky at my husband. He's like, oh, she's writing again. But so it was not done with structure or the sort of like novelistic approach or having some kind of like prose mechanism or like a deliberate outline. It just wasn't done that way. I had it as these modular pieces. And what ended up coming together, I would sit down one day and say, okay, today I'm going to write the Paris story. Today I'm going to write this month I'm going to write the shtetl, which required quite a bit more research. Today I'm going to write the Met conversation. There were things that came to me as my grandma, and I would write them in their purest possible way. Then I had all of this stuff. I had 250 pages of writing of my grandma in a Word document. And I'm a TV writer and I think visually. And I came up with a system that I don't necessarily recommend. It worked for exactly this book, but I put conversations on blue index cards, stories and yellow index cards, and voicemails on these sort of like orangey salmon index cards. It's just what we had at my parents' apartment where I ended up finishing the book. And I lay them all out on the floor, and the themes were all there. The stories that were about the mother next to the voicemail that were about this, like they were all there. She had told me the book. They were all interrelated. And so what I thought would be this sort of like hours long, a beautiful mind process was a very simple and very clearly delineated, thematically linked story. And then of course I went back in and made the connections make more sense. And in the editing of the book was able to see the rough cohesive structure that I had placed together with index cards make sense. And then above all of them, I had pieces of printer paper that I always knew were going to be the sections of the book because it was a matrilineal love story, but it was my mother, your mother, our life together, and after me. And I always knew those were the main components of the book, even though I would write it, depending on what, it sounds very pretentious, what was speaking to me, but really what was, what felt important to write, or what I remembered, or what interviewing my grandpa or interviewing my mom came up. And so the index card method plus knowing the matrilineal love story plus an after death experience was going to be the structure, made it all came together.
And perfectly. You mentioned having to do research for the book, and I was going to ask you about that. Did you have to do a lot of research? And for, I would imagine for which sections, but do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. I actually am sitting right next to the stack of books that I I'm sitting right next to the stack of books. They were resting on this pacifier on my. I have a baby, so that's my office is full of books about pogroms and also a book called Good Dog Carl, which is equally harrowing in different ways. Kid's left alone and put in a fish tank. He's fine. But the books that so the approach to this section, and for those of you who haven't read it, or maybe for those of you who did and are interested, the story about the shtetl, the story about Pinsk, a town in Belarus under the Pale of Settlement under Tsar Alexander II, where my great grandmother emigrated from, was completely constructed based on the most scant possible biographical detail, which is actually in my grandmother's obituary that the family paid for in the Palm Beach Post and syndicated wherever. It is Bobby Bell is the daughter of Rose Otis, who escaped from Russia alone at the age of 12 and came to the United States. And that's all we had.
That's all you have.
Yeah, like most, and or not, I can't generalize, but as was common for certainly the people who my grandma's friends with and I'm friends with, who were children of immigrants from escaping the pogroms. You just didn't talk about the old country. You didn't talk about the journey. It was just certainly not something that you spoke about with your children. So in this idea of a life story as what's passed from mother to daughter, there is this blank volume of, okay, well, what happened to get to the United States from wherever Jews fled persecution to get here. And the story had no shape and no face, except for a photograph, which is in the book, which is of my great grandmother Rose at age 14 in New York. And she is standing there with the countenance of a 45-year-old, this sort of wizened, it's a harrowing picture, really. It's just this sort of stoic baby, this stoic little girl who had seen more in her 14 years than I certainly have seen in however old I am, 34 or 33. I'm technically not sure. But I think I'm 34, 1980s. Okay. I birthdays have not really mattered since I've had a kid. So
Like systems of COVID or
anything, or since I turned 21, I don't think I've had a birth. But I should know that answer. It's a note to myself. But how old are you? But but in honesty, I mean, what it goes to show is just how heroic and impossible my great grandmother's life was. So to get to the root of it, I called my old college and I asked for the Russian Studies department. And I ended up speaking to a few professors and got a reading list. And then when some of it was I was like, oh, that's way too dense. And then sort of went and researched and found some other books. And what I have here ended up creating a picture of the shtetl and a picture of the journey. Another source I'll say before I show these Jewish books was the testimony of Italian immigrants, testimony to Congress in 1917. These women in trying to fight for the immigrant rights for this Ellis Island Protection Group testified before Congress about the terrible conditions on steamships from Italy and steamships from various places in continental Europe to get to the United States. And that ended up being something that at the time illuminated this horrible underworld of what it was like to be in steerage. And they spoke about the Jewish passengers. These Italian immigrants spoke about Jews who wouldn't eat at all because there was no kosher food. And they ended up unintentionally shedding light on a harrowing Jewish plight. So the books that I used were The Atlas of Jewish History by Martin Gilbert. This is just a book of maps. Each map is a epic Lord of the Rings style story in its own right. Each one follows sort of this impossible by foot, by train, by horse cart idea of how Jews escaped the Pale of Settlement to get to the United States, Israel, or London. And the Jews of Eastern Europe was a way that I could really zero in on my great grandparents' community and figure out, okay, how did information get passed between people? What were the newspapers like? What was it like to go to school? And then what were the laws that the Tsar and his army constructed to effectively make it illegal to be Jewish? And how did that affect life for children? Kosher meat was taxed in this bizarre way. You were not allowed to study Talmud, and that was a way to keep Jews illiterate. There were all of these stories that I knew nothing about, shamefully. Becoming Soviet Jews was a harrowing read. The Bolshevik experiment in Minsk was basically about my great grandparents' town and what it was like when the pogroms came through. And then this book is quite well known. Steven Zipperstein's Pogrom was just a very human and readable account of just how brutal life was for Jews who had effectively been blamed for the assassination of a czar. And when paranoia was running rampant, what it felt like to live under persecution and feel like you had to get out, and what it was like to have this idea of the Golden Medina, the promised land in America, and not be able to get there. That was also something that I had to account for my great grandmother's experience. And then just for a little color, Shtetl, the Golden Age, and a few Isaac Bashevis Singer stories, because nobody does it better. And I tried to get beyond my like Fiddler in the Roof idea of, which isn't to knock Fiddler on the Roof. It's great. Truly, but I had a sort of musical idea of what my great grandmother's life was like, and now I was able to construct just how impossible that journey was, and how we are all products. All Jews in America are products of diaspora and escape and a reaction to persecution. And my God, the heroism of our ancestors is something that is humbling to this day. And so as a result, there's about a 15-20 page account of it, and nobody will tell you this but me, but it was by far the hardest part to write and the most illuminating part of this entire writing experience. So I hope all of those books go into a very small thing here, and I hope it worked.
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to say, I really felt like it was this byproduct of I felt like I was reading history, even though that wasn't the intent. So I absolutely thought it was excellently done. And I would even extend that to you talking about your grandfather in the construction industry and working with the mafia. And did you, I mean, I've heard stories like that in my own family as well. So that rang very true to me. Did you have to do any research about that, or how did that come about?
I have on my iTunes on this very computer about an hour and 45-minute conversation with my grandfather, where if anything happens to either of us, like it can't get out. My grandfather could write a John le Carré style, spy thriller about his life and his life in business in Westchester, New York, in the building and construction industry. And then he became a professor and sort of went straight. My grandfather, there really is only so much I can say, because my grandfather ended up going to Russia a lot during the Cold War, on State Department funded trips, and the sort of like spy meets mafia life that he led could be its own book, but it's not. This is his wife's book, and and so there were times when I was interviewing my grandpa when I was like, the plane never left the tarmac, but the guy was dead by the time it took off again. And like, when I was like, oh my God, these stories, which is, they're another book in and of themselves, but it really was a lot of fun having these conversations with my grandpa, conversations which I had with him many, many times over the course of my life. But him knowing that they were going toward a book memorializing his wife, his beloved, gave us a way to connect and talk about her and talk about his memories of their early life together. which with a renewed sense of purpose, and it got his agenda in the book about her, as any book would have.
Wow, that was beautiful. Yeah, just getting back to them, I wanted to ask, did writing this give you a sense of a different sense of empathy or understanding for your mother, your grandmother, your great grandmother?
Definitely. I mean, that really was, I think, the biggest surprise in writing it, and the biggest shift that happened was in that empathy response for my mother. Um, I think if you want 40 years of therapy in one writing assignment, write a book about your mother in the voice of her mother. Um, and it really is,
Yeah.
that'll do the trick. And I saw her struggles in a new light, and also her personality shaping in a new light, and it became this sort of way to justify so many things that, and explain and give context for so many things that I have as a daughter, resented and butted heads with my mother over. And this really did end up, this book ended up being a way of seeing her in a new light. And I think it's because I was seeing her as somebody's child. And that I think the two events that shape the way I think about my mother most are writing this book and giving birth to my son. They were just sort of immediate forgiveness. And I had no epidural for this one, for the book.
Oh,
I did.
oh, okay.
I will say this: having the child is easier. Don't tell him that. He'll never. This is not recorded.
Oh, oh, that's too much.
Less technically.
There's a lot in the book that's about our anxieties, about anxiety, and well, at least I saw it that way. And I wanted to know, now that you're a parent, and also I feel like we live in this time when we acknowledge anxiety and talk about it in a way that our parents and our grandparents didn't have the language for. And the way, like the stories, how your grandmother, when you were in school and you didn't want to go to school and she took you to lunch, how do you have any different, how do you feel about that now as an adult?
Well, first of all, that's a brilliant and surprising and empathetic question. That I haven't gotten. That is a huge part of this book, and a huge part of what my grandmother and I saw in each other as kindred people. There's a little passage that in the book about our insomnia, and how we were just sort of staring up at the ceiling in the middle of the night, two minds whirring in the dark. And that is my sort of testament to our shared anxiety. And exactly the anecdote that you're talking about, when I was picked up from school to go out on these fun lunch outings with her, wasn't just sort of like a playing hooky lark. It was because I was too nervous to socialize, and too nervous to go to the cafeteria. I can't, it was the type of thing that my grandmother recognized in me, because she saw it in herself. And in saving me from my own anxiety, we were able to make this sort of fun side relationship, make it this fun other thing that could exist outside of the anxiety. And so seeing her as this refuge, and this little protective world that was in the back of her Acura, was the sort of escape from really the inside of my own addled kid head, my own anxious head. And so this definitely is a book that attempts to unpack what it's like to be an anxious kid. And I'm so grateful for my grandma for seeing that in me, and picking me up from those sleepovers and those school days, and really as early as preschool, which is not necessarily a social anxiety, that's a separation anxiety, but see, very, very early in my life, she was somebody who made me feel okay wherever I was, and that's because she was there.
Very special. Very, very special. I wanted to ask you about the two versions of the same story, because I just love that idea, the concept of it. But how did that come about?
Yeah, that's something that so two versions of the same story is the story of my birth. And it's really the story of my mother going into labor with me and um just and everything that happened around that. So it's why would she have a baby at the time that she did, what she was feeling while she was pregnant, and then what it was like to look at me for the first time. And it's two versions of the same story because I will never know any version of that story as many times as I hear it. It really was sort of me as the writer tipping to the reader for in the most obvious way, except for the few times my grandma yells at me for writing a book in the book. But it was my attempted to be sort of a writerly way of saying, look, I don't know what happened because I wasn't born yet. And this is the moment of that we're going to see me for the first time in the book. And I'm not the person to give an account of it. So how reliable is this book about anything? If I wasn't there.
Right.
And so that was my sort of tip of this is an unreliable narrator, not because my grandmother is unreliable, but because I am. And it also was a way to sort of in the great therapy exercise that this book was as a writer. And what I've heard from readers is what it feels like as a reader. I'm glad we can all be in this sort of like maternal grief fever dream together. But, but how wonderful to feel less alone in it. But that moment also was my way of processing what how my mom really must have feared becoming a mother, and how out of step with the life that she had planned for herself it was, and how transformative it must have been for her in a way that I'll never fully know. But I give these sort of two polar opposite reactions to it to sort of say, okay, split the difference, and I'm sure it exists somewhere in this sort of space between the two. Yeah.
I love that. It's wonderful. You mentioned at one point about how your family has either read, not read the book. How have they reacted to you writing this book and it being, how have they reacted to the book?
I mean, to my face, they've loved it. So, they're
Of
all.
course.
I'm like, da, 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 the family that loves the book. And they're like, oh God, what did she do? Fortunately, the people that I wrote the book for, my grandfather and my mother, really in that order, really find the book to be a comfort and to be a special testament to and memorial to somebody that they miss and love. And it's not a stalling tactic. I really was very thirsty, but I do realize how the interrogation room that would have been a sort of like, let's start recording.
This is not supposed to feel like an interrogation.
No, it doesn't at all. It doesn't at all. I was behaving like I was drinking then, but really it wasn't. No, I will say no, this could be further from that. Really, what it felt like to be a family member who wrote this book was to be very honest and say, this is a matrilineal love story. This is an account of my relationship with grandma, this is my relationship with Bobby. And really only accounts for that. And my grandmother was somebody who had 7 grandchildren who she loved fiercely and equally. And that each of them have a book. Each of them have their own story to tell. Each of her friends have a book. Her sister-in-law has a book. One woman cannot be reduced to one relationship. This relationship can only serve as sort of my memorial to her, as my very long-winded eulogy. But it does feel to her family members in the same way that at that funeral they recognized her in my telling of her. It does feel like an intimate experience of her, even if it's just through my lens. My admittedly rose-colored at times, and also warped by my own experiences at times. But it does feel like as close as I could get to her, and because I knew her so well, and because she and I had an inarguably special bond, it does feel like a way into her for other family members who have read it. My grandpa, though, has a stack of the book at his lobby in his apartment building in Florida, and they are all signed with his name. It's like you're getting a Hank Down, and he's so
I
proud of
love
it.
it.
The first week it came out, he was like calling bookstores in big cities and like Washington, D.C. and Chicago, being like, "Do you have the book by Bess Kalb about Bobby Bell?" He didn't know the title, but he's very proud of it.
Oh my God, I love that. I love that. What would she have to say to us or to you about COVID and dealing with the pandemic? And what do you
She
think she would say about that?
I think she'd just be so devastated not to be able to be with her loved ones and not to be with her family. And her friends, because she was such a social person to the end. When she had to be wheeled to Bridge, she wouldn't give up. But the spirit in this book and the lesson of her life and the lesson that she gave me was what was hinted at very early in this presentation, which was something that her Zader said. It's when you feel like, she would say this to me, and for those of you who haven't read it, maybe you're hearing it for the first time, then this adage, but she would tell me throughout her life, "Bessie, when you feel like the earth is cracking behind your feet and the whole world is going to swallow you up, you put one foot in front of the other and you keep going." And that's exactly for now. Like this is the lesson that she gave me. I rolled my eyes at it when it was like losing a soccer game or whatever it was, for a time when it does feel like the world is splitting open, when there is an abyss behind us. Putting one foot in front of the other has never been more important. And it's a beautiful sentiment that I'm so glad she passed on to me. And I'm so glad I put in a book that was released right at the beginning of a time when so many people would have to cling to that sense of resilience and hope that she gave us. And so that is absolutely what she would say to me. As privately devastated as we all can be, as she certainly would have been, there was that marching order. And so she would be, banging that drum every single day. And she would also always put on some lipstick and a nice blouse, and she would do her hair, and she would have dinner, and she would carry on. And that is just the style that she lived with. And it's when the days where I am just like sweatpants and, eating oatmeal out of the pot, eating off of my son's plate. That's when there are moments where I have my grandma in my head going, "Bessie, you get yourself together." And then that night I'll maybe like, yeah, tuck my hair behind my ears
Yes.
for dinner.
I love that. And I think that's part of what spoke to all of us reading this and felt like it was a perfect book for tonight. I have no idea how much time we have left. So I know Rachel will pop in whenever it's the right time. There she is. I have more questions, but you can talk. Do we have a bunch of questions?
We do have some questions, but I think they may be along the same lines. If you want to keep going, you can go. It's up to you.
I was gonna, maybe one of them was, I think some people they listened to the book on audiobook, and I heard that you actually narrated it yourself.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know what that was like, and yeah. How did you enjoy doing that?
Well, I think we spoke a little bit. I had just given birth when I narrated the audiobook. I was a brand new first time mom, and I had not been away from my son for more than like a shower. And so I was suddenly like in this strange building that vaguely looked like it was out of Being John Malkovich, this strange office building in downtown Los Angeles, with like a audiobook, the Penguin Random House sort of satellite recording studio with tons of filing cabinets and a couple of like gruff sound engineers and one guy who's seen it all. And they shoved me into a booth and they put my grandmother's life story in front of me on an iPad on a music stand. And there's a microphone in my face. And I read the first sentence and I just burst out crying. It was, and that's they all sort of looked at each other and went, "Oh, this is going to be one of those long ones." But I ended up rallying remarkably fast because I wanted to just get it done and get back to the baby. Um, so what it ended up being like after the initial shock of being anywhere else, which I'm sure we will all feel like when the world opens back up again, as soon as we're in another place, it really did feel like that for me. Like I was coming out of this black hole and suddenly doing the audiobook. But you got this good performance out of it because there was real emotion behind it, and I ended up reading a few chapters, pumping, and then crying, and then going back and reading some more. And by the end, I was pretty worked up. And for those of you who read it, the last bit of the book is an afterlife experience. It's my grandmother basically narrating the very end of her life, and it was a very emotional thing to write. I was sobbing writing it, which is kind of embarrassing to admit, but I was, it was a very private and personal thing to write. And when I read that part of the audiobook, that was the first time I had ever read it again. um, it was really a piece of writing that I sent to my editor, and I said, this was really a sort of a gesture from me. I can't get into the comma placements. Like, I trust you. I this is how it should be. And she was like, "You're right. Yes, fine." And I read it again, and I read it out loud, and I was crying, and this sort of like sweet audio guy and like his black shirt, his like goatee, and like whatever, he'd like come from doing like the American Music Awards or something the night before, was there, and he was crying, and we like hugged at the end pre-COVID, and it ended up being this very cathartic experience for us both, I'd like to say. But mostly it was a traumatic thing that I survived, one foot in front of the other.
Well, I'm glad that you did it.
Enjoyed the
have
audiobook.
any
It almost
other?
broke me.
Do you have any other books in mind that or other projects that you're working on that you
Yeah,
want to tell us about?
sure. So I actually I no longer write for Kimmel. I gave my notice the week before lockdown happened, and so I still haven't cleared out my desk. The my goodbye party was over Zoom. I left for two reasons, for two projects. I regret leaving every day. It was the best job in the world, and I miss them so much. I miss everybody so much. We're all still in a Zoom trivia group. But I left because the book was optioned to be made into a movie, which I'm writing the screenplay
Wow.
for. And
Congratulations.
thank you. It's very exciting. It's being made with just a fun, like an incredible indie production company that made movies that I really love. They're called Sight Unseen Productions. They made a movie called Dear White People, which was very great. And they made a movie called with Hugh Jackman and Allison Janney called Bad Education, which I loved.
Mhm.
And they're super great. There were also a production company that acquiesced to my sort of like weird demand that if I were to make a movie, it had to have a female director. And that's something that a lot of people in the industry that I guess I'm about to work and talk about a lot, but then sort of like, oh, well, he'd be great for this project. And he says, like, I needed to make sure I had a female director. And so Elizabeth Chomko, who's a brilliant director, happens to be a woman, is directing it. She made a movie with Michael Shannon called What They Had, and it's about Alzheimer's, and it's about her grandmother's experience with it. And it is such a beautiful, tender portrait of aging, and I entrust her with essentially my family's life. But so now I'm writing it, and that's what I'm working on. And I also have a comedy show coming out. I have it on December 30th. If you have Amazon Video, I am the executive producer and creator and head writer of a show called Yearly Departed. I'm sort of like big into death is my comedy wheelhouse. It is a satirical funeral for 2020, starring all female comedians hosted by Phoebe
I love
Robinson,
it.
Sarah Silverman, and Rachel Brosnahan, and Natasha Rothwell, Patty Harrison, Natasha Leggero, and Ziwei Fumido, and yeah, that's the lineup. Am I forgetting anybody? Hope not. Oh, and Tiffany Haddish. That's so it's called Yearly Departed on Amazon, and it's going to be oddly a lot of fun, even though it's fun at a funeral, which is what got me into this mess anyway.
Sounds fabulous. Thank you for sharing all that. Rachel, did you have other questions?
I did. I'm keeping an eye on the time, so we'll just have time for just a few. And I apologize if we don't get to your question. One, it's just very funny. One of the first comments that came in, Bess, just giving what you were saying you were doing. It wasn't so much a question, but I just finished reading the book. You were so lucky to have her as your grandmother. And as you described her, it sounds like someone who would need to direct her own funeral. Great story. This is from Toby. So I just felt like that was very on point. You actually talked a little bit about the audiobook, and we had chatted before ourselves on that. From Linda, loved your book, first audiobook I ever listened to, and your voice was wonderful. You captured her essence so well. My question, how were you able to remember all her stories? Had you written them down over the years? Did you conjure up some of them?
Yeah, I never wrote them down. She just told them so many times. My grandmother hammered her stories into me. She probably knew that I was going to do something with them. I mean, she would really, really repeat them. The best part of the way that she repeated them is the details would always change just a little bit, depending on what her agenda was. The reason that she was telling this sort of Aesop's fable about her brothers switching places, or about my mom and the pink milk, or like about the March on Washington. You know, she always had a reason to tell her stories. And because she used her life stories as a way to tell me what to do with my life, I heard her life stories a lot. And so that's why I've said this before. It's a sort of strange thing to say, so bear with me, but there was a New York article recently, thank you very much, about a robot, an AI robot that listened to 10,000 hours of Shakespeare and then could write Shakespeare. And I am the AI robot for Bobby Bell. I listen to 10,000 hours of her, and so I can just write her. That is my only skill. So that's how.
Very good. I think and that question was about writing down, but I think because we know about the voicemails, that gives it something too that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And this one's more specific, but I did think it was interesting. You talked about one of the hardest parts of the research was sort of the shtetl research.
Yeah.
Did she tell you, how did you find out that your great grandmother got the money to leave by selling things to the milkman or through the milkman? So obviously they've really read the book.
Yeah. So that is old writer head over here. That is figuring out ways that children were able to escape alone. There were, in the forwarding stations throughout, the reason that Jews would go to forwarding stations throughout Central Europe was there was no safe way to actually get from Russia, from Belarus or Odessa or the Pale of Settlement to a port city that was going to America. So Jews would shelter other Jews. And there were, in some of these books, there were stories about the children alone in forwarding stations. And they all had these strange jobs to get the $20, get however many shekels it was, to forward a ticket to America. And a really common way to do it was by the grace of other Jews. And Jews who had money were able to buy kosher milk. And so following a kosher milkman was a way to sort of, selling rags was begging, but it was a way to, with dignity, say, I have these things if you have any money. And they would see a desperate child and give a tiny bit of what for Jews was disposable income, enough money to buy milk. And so that's how I pieced that one together.
I have one more question. I'm just giving you the cue, Rochelle, if you have anything else after, and then otherwise I'll close out the program. Did your mother read the book?
Yes. It took a lot to get her to read it. This is a good story. It took me threatening legal action against myself. There was a legal read that happened many iterations, like manuscript and first draft and second draft. The book there were many opportunities, there were many big Word documents and Google Drive files that I sent her going like, what do you think? And a few of those early tests of like, what did you think of this scene were at my mom because I knew she didn't read it. That's the person who my husband and I would be like, and how about that story of your guys' wedding? Like just things that were not in the book, because I knew she was avoiding it, and she was avoiding it for good reason. She picked it up initially at the very first, before I sent it to Erin Malone, when it was just those 40 pages, when I said, I'm thinking of sending something about grandma to a place that could potentially make it public. She was the first person I sent it to. And she read the first page of it and she said, I can't, that's her. And so respect, fine. That's not where she was in her grieving process. And I didn't want to re-traumatize her. Understandable, of course. So eventually there's a legal read that happens when a book has a cover and is bound and is ready to go out. And the lawyers at the publishing house said, okay, so we did the legal read. There are like a few things here and there. Most of the names are changed. My mom's husband, people like that, even Estelle, his name is changed. And they said, all of the questions are about your mother. She has to read this book. She is you are the most open to lawsuit. But I'm like, my mom, who's in the next room, who, we would walk into traffic for each other. Like, it's not an issue. And they were like, under penalty of law, you have to have your mom read this book. So I literally sent her a lawyer's email and was like, pursuant to this code, you have to read the book and do this legal read. And so she sat down and she read the book kind of dispassionately. She read it, she closed it, and she said, that was the most painful thing that I've ever done since giving birth to you. And, it's beautiful. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you. She was my primary source for the book. So of course she knew what was going into it. She told me the story Pink Milk, and I was typing as she was giving me the details of like the litany of it. She told me the Mexico story. She told me the going to college story. She told me stories that I elected not to put in the book because they were too personal about her. But reading the whole thing all together in her mother's voice was very different. And so she, fortunately, because of legal action, did. And even though it was painful for her to do, and it has been the type of thing that in the years since my grandmother's death, as she and I have both processed it in different ways, we refer to as our common language. If nothing else, this book is a bridge between me and my mother. And I'm so grateful that she gave me everything I needed to write it. And I'm so grateful that it's meant something to her. I did my job because my mom approves of it, like so many other Jewish women will understand. So yes, that was the final end of my grandmother's work, was bringing us together it does feel like bringing my mom and I together through this book.
I'm trying not to.
Oh,
Yeah, it's such a lovely sentiment. Rochelle, did you have any last questions or anything?
No, I'm just going to say thank you so much for Bess for writing this book and for being here and sharing yourself with us. And can't wait to see the next couple things that you mentioned. I will definitely check them all out.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Rochelle. This was such a fun and insightful conversation from you. I really am so appreciative of you for your comments and coming at it with such insight and empathy and your own experience. And to have an event like this for your mom is so special. It's so special to be a part of this, and just may her memory be a blessing in everything that you do and all the ways you bring people together, in her legacy. Thank you, Rochelle. And thank you, Rachel. And thank you to everybody at Shalom Austin. This is so fun. Thank you.
Thank you. It's hard to follow up you too. Thank you everyone who attended and joined us and joined us on your Sunday night. Huge thanks to Bess. We cannot wait to I was like taking notes of all of the things to watch. I can't wait. So we will keep following you. Hopefully maybe next year or the next year, it'll be like in the South by Film Fest and you can come to Austin and we can hang.
Oh my God, I would love that.
So we hope to have you again or perhaps another book. And as always, huge thanks thanks to the Brittman family and this special relationship with Shalom Austin. We also very much hope that next year for the annual Brittman event, maybe we all get to be in person, but we're so lucky to be able to do this virtually, and just such a wonderful event. So we thank everyone for attending, and we hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.